your career has spanned a number of really interesting key pillars. So not least the fact that you've got this best-in-class scientific background combined with working on the VC side of things and then moving into the biotech world. So I'd love to hear in your own words kind of where this whole journey started and how you ended up having an interest to, take us into the biotech field in the first place.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for having me. It's always great to interact with you and the ARTO team. So I'm very much looking forward to this discussion. Yeah. So, I mean, my kind of journey space is somewhat circuitous. I kind of, on some level, kind of fell backwards into the biopharma space because I never really intended to work in it. Right. I was a biologist I loved science when I was in high school. And when I was in college, I was also studying biochemistry and microbiology. And I thought I was going to go to medical school. It was kind of the path. And then I actually took a position at a large pharmaceutical organization. And it kind of just changed my view of what I wanted to do. And that kind of shuttled me towards like doing a Ph.D. Wanted to do R&D in the context of the biopharmaceutical sector, the early stage drug development, which is where I kind of cut my teeth, right, as it relates to kind of my scientific journey. So because of that experience, I went back to school and I did a PhD at the University of Toronto in the laboratory of Dr. Tak Mak. And then through that experience, because Dr. Mak is very much kind of a serial entrepreneur and is well connected. VC community, founded a number of companies, Treadwell, which is the company I used to be the CEO of, as well as Agios, which is a Cambridge base. It used to be kind of a oncology play, but they've kind of shifted focus a bit. But nonetheless, my exposure with him and kind of opened me up to the concept of building companies in the life science space. So I became actually very interested at the time in investing in biotech. So I did a bit of that in the public markets on the side while I was doing a PhD and made the decision to do an M.B.A. Shortly after I finished my PhD, which was actually funded by the Canadian government for people that have PhDs in the life sciences to do an M.B.A.
Oh, wow.
So completed that work. And then, I was trying to get into kind of the financial world. And that's when I moved to New York City to be an equity analyst at an investment bank focusing on biotech companies. So that was a really interesting experience. Learned a lot about just the kind of the world of finance and Wall Street in general, but kind of knew early on that I really wanted to be on the other side of the street, and the other side being an investor. So I was a hedge fund manager for a good number of years, which was really an amazing experience because it kind of taught me a lot about how companies operate on a certain level, right? How management teams kind of comport themselves and how a good story kind of resonates with the investment community. So that was also a great experience. But I also, in the back of my mind, kind of thought that eventually I wanted to be kind of an operator in the space, right? Just because, it was great being an investor. It was really fun, actually, because for someone who's really deep into science and really loves the biotech space in general, it's just a great opportunity to learn about a number of different companies, technologies, disease indications. It was a really great experience, but I wanted to get back to kind of like operating within the biotech space. So we found
Was that like a fulfillment-based decision?
What do you mean?
So I suppose almost like the warm fuzzy feelings in the pit of your stomach. It's more about, was that more a decision, almost like an emotion-led decision almost at some point?
Well, on some level it was, right? Like I think conceptually I wanted to do it, but like in terms of the emotion of it, I mean, the company that we founded was a company called Nirsum Laboratories, which is still going strong and doing very well. I continue to work with them, but we wanted to start a company that was going to develop kind of best-in-class medicines for addiction. Right. And I have a family member, he's doing very well, but, in the past he struggled with addiction. I see kind of the pain it caused families. And, in the United States, there's millions upon millions of people that have clinically defined opioid use disorder and tens of millions of people that struggle with alcoholism. Right. And there's really not the best kind of suite of medicines for those kind of disease indications. So, me and my colleague, who I co-founded the company with, Dr. Nikesh Shah, we were, very interested in kind of joining the fray, as it were, and kind of developing novel drugs for that space. So on some level, it was just like, this is what I want to do. I want to start companies and be operating companies. But I also like the disease indication was something that was very meaningful to me and continues to be very meaningful, particularly as the molecule that we actually invented is now about to embark on phase 2 studies. And we think we could change the world with that molecule. So So that was one experience, and it was really fun. It was interesting insofar as when we started the company, we really wanted to use kind of non-dilutive money to build value in the program. So we got some money from the NIH. At the time that I was at the company and was the CSO, we got 50 million from the NIH, and recently the company got 50 million more. Um,
Hmm.
so if someone told me, 10 years ago, as I was moving to work on Wall Street, that I would be a principal investigator on an NIH grant, I would have laughed in their face. I mean, that's what happened, and was the right business move for the company, because you can, in the absence of investor dollars, you can build value, right? And get proof of concept, which we have. So it's actually a very, very exciting program. But at that stage, it was kind of a tough decision for me. But I had this opportunity to leave Nirsum and become the CEO of another biotech company called Therapeutics, which was this kind of scratched my like novel science itch on some level,
Hmm. Hmm.
developing kind of a multimodality pipeline of first-in-class medicines for unmet need in cancer, both solid and liquid tumors. So that was a really interesting experience. This was a company, like I said, with a big pipeline and kind of a broad geographic footprint. As I do right now, as I did back in those days, I sit in New York City. We had team members in Boston. We had team members in San Francisco. We had team members in Toronto and also in Hong Kong. So it was a very kind of broad organization, and it was a kind of an audacious goal, right? We developed these kind of novel agents. So that was a really interesting experience, because it taught me about leadership. It taught me what's necessary to build companies. It got me kind of interacting with executive search professionals such as yourself. It was just a great learning experience, insofar as that I really learned how to be a leader. Also kind of like tell the story to the street. Thousands of investor meetings, meetings with strategic partners, and this and that and the other. It was a very great experience. But at one point I decided that it was time for me to move on. After about 4 years, I told myself I would do 2 or 3, and after about 4, I was like, I got to step away, take some time for myself. And so I did that, and eventually I started as the CEO of a company called 3IO Therapeutics, which is an early stage kind of biotech company developing preclinically developing novel viral immunotherapies for cancer, which I'm still at today. Yeah, as well as that role, I'm also a board director and advisor to Nirsum Laboratories, the company that I mentioned previously that I founded years ago. So that's kind of the journey. I always joke with people, the reason that I'm doing what I'm doing is and it's a bit trite, but not far off. The reason that I'm doing what I'm doing is because of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and people look at me when I tell them that, and it's like, what are you talking about, you crazy? But it's because my experience in pharma was I was in Japan, right? That's the role at Big Pharma that I had for several years, and I wanted to go over there because of my interest in Japanese culture, and because of that, I got kind of warm to the pharmaceutical sector, right? So when I say I fell backwards into this,
Yeah, yeah.
I think it's far off.
You see a lot of candidates in biotech, especially, or big pharma, who get to an inflection point in their career where they actually have a real interest in going into the investment side of things.
Yeah.
It usually works that way round, and then they leverage their experience. Whereas what you've done is actually flipped it on its head, like you say, fell backwards. So it's really interesting how that's come about. I'd love to know how doing it that way round has, in your opinion, helped you.
Yeah, certainly with thinking about value, right? And thinking about
Yeah.
what's a compelling investment thesis, right? And how to tell that story. I think is very helpful, right? Because when you come at it from the other way, like, you learn a lot about kind of operations, and you learn a lot about kind of building companies. But if you're working at, one large pharma organization for 20 years, it's very narrow, right? When you're an investor, you're looking at a universe of different opportunities, different kind of philosophies in terms of management, development, modalities, indications, right? So I think it gives you a very broad view of what you're looking at. Yeah, the learning curve, if you're coming it from either direction, the learning curve when you make that switch is very steep, and it certainly was for me when I was leading an innovative company, and I'm certain it would be for some head of R&D to come work at a VC firm, right? But I think being an investor gives you a very broad view of things. There's lots of kind of vignettes and stories that you've seen over the years of management teams that have done things in a certain way that worked or didn't work, right? So it helps in terms of strategy, and it helps in terms of like just having a broad view of the space.
Yeah, I can really see that actually. And then, like you say, the investment side of things is more broad, but
Yeah,
then the scientist in you probably goes quite deep.
yeah, true. Look, and I mean, I think most investors worth their salt are going to do very deep due diligence on scientific aspects of any story, right? I think it just comes part and parcel with this business, right? I think on some level, it's like you only need to do so much, right? Because
Yeah.
you understand the science, but what's really important is the probabilistic assessment of whether or not a drug is going to be successful, which is like can be scientific, it can be not. Right. So yeah, I mean, I think there is kind of that, right? We have a broad view, but like when you're interested in an investment opportunity, you dig deep.
And when looking at the biotech side of things and that journey, but also from a broad overview, is there a similarity, or is what makes a good biotech the same from a biotech perspective as it is from the investor side of things?
I mean, yes and no, right? Like, I mean, I think a biotech can be like not a great investment, but can be a great company to work at, right? And
Yeah,
vice
good
versa.
point.
Like, I think, some of the greatest opportunities that I looked at, maybe those weren't the best places to work, right?
Yeah,
And I won't name names, but there's probably one of my favorite companies when I was an investor was not a great investment opportunity just because the market valued it inappropriately, and that happens all the time, right? So I mean, yeah, it doesn't necessarily equate, right? Because a great company to work at is very different than a great company to invest in, right? It can be very, very different.
really interesting point actually, because you do put them in the same bucket when you think about it holistically. I suppose yeah, because when it comes down to valuation and all those kind of concepts.
It's also about culture, right? Because it's like and you only see, when you're an investor, you only see what's best in a company, right? They're putting their best foot forward. You don't know what's going on
Yeah,
under the hood, right?
yeah.
And maybe just a poor culture and maybe a toxic environment, it just maybe not the best place to be as a company, right? But that can be very different than if it makes it for a good investment, right? Because you only see kind of opportunity value, durability of potential cash flows downstream, like hardcore kind of investment thesis kind of points, right? But there's so much more that's intangible to that makes people that work at that organization happy and willing to work their butt off to achieve an audacious goal of getting a drug approved.
So I suppose the really interesting insight there then would be when you then went into the biotech side of things with the kind of the VC hat on, if you like, you took that off and then plugged into biotech. And what was your vision of what you wanted to build a culture like?
Look, I mean, it's just kind of a function of my personality to build a culture of excellence. You'll probably hear me say trust a lot as we continue
Yeah,
this conversation. But, I wanted to bring in a team that I could trust and a team that could trust me because, I think the philosophy in this business is you hire the best people and you get out of their way. I think you can't micromanage people. And that's kind of the approach that we took, certainly at Treadwell was, and Nirsum as well. You hire people that have been there before, that have had successes, right? And you hire people that are great people to work with and be around. And then you give them the support that they need and they trust you to make the right decisions. And then, beautiful music can be made at the end of the day.
yeah.
Right. I mean, I think it's really about building a culture of trust and belief and excitement.
So so let's say for example an employee was going to join you, and when you're in the biotech side of things, what is there a standardized route map for you as a CEO to portray that excitement and building the belief and everything in what you're doing?
I mean, I wouldn't say that there's a roadmap, right? I mean, I think if
Yeah,
you're leading an organization, you believe in it, then that will come through, right? And I think if you have the personality it's maybe a Boolean, which maybe I have a bit, right? I think that just comes through, right? And
yeah,
I think
absolutely.
because it's like when you're bringing in candidates. I mean, I don't have to tell you guys, right? I mean, when you're bringing in candidates, it's like they're pitching themselves, but you're also pitching,
Yeah,
right? If
yeah,
if you're, I mean, it's a little different in this day and age, right? Given kind of the nature of the kind of the hiring environment, but I think if you're pitching someone that's like got decades of experience in clinical drug development in the Bay Area, they're talking to you and they're talking to 10 other opportunities, right? Because, these people don't grow on trees, and there's many companies that need great people to execute on their objectives, right? So I mean, I think you're definitely selling the company, and I think you have to, I don't think there's a formula, right? I certainly don't have one, but it's just, you need to convey your excitement for the story, right? And I think that comes out naturally if you're a believer in the story.
yeah. A big part, actually, when we work with early stage companies, a massive part of us supporting them is helping them build their value proposition. because
Yeah.
quite often they've actually got a great story, to use the word that you used earlier,
Yeah.
but they don't necessarily know how to get that down or to articulate that in a way that's thought through and structured. And then you take that value proposition to the marketplace when it comes to the best candidates. Because, like anyone, the best candidates want to understand the scientific value add or differentiation factor. They want to understand the leadership structure of that company
Yeah.
and what it can do for them. And the funding runway is always key. There's massive considerations that all feed into that value proposition.
You what you're describing is similar to is talking to VCs, talking to investors, right? It's very much so.
Yeah.
Because I think what you need to portray is value, right? You need to portray opportunity. You need to portray a competitive dynamic that's favorable to your program, right? And you do that to a certain extent. You do that with incoming candidates because by and large they're likely fairly sophisticated and understand the space. And you're also doing that to investors for sure.
Yeah, managing up and managing around and managing key stakeholders. And
Exactly.
then from a biotech building and drug development standpoint, what, in your opinion, if there was simplified differentiation factors between a good and a great biotech?
I mean, many different factors, right? Like I think again, internal culture that's maybe not necessarily
Yeah,
kind of visible externally is super important because if people are happy, if people are working their fingers to the bone because they really, really believe in what they're doing and it gives them joy and fulfillment, I think that's super important, right? But also, I mean, it's a business, right? So you need to really understand, you need to understand kind of like where your product fits in the marketplace, right? I think that's kind of a problem that a lot of young companies have is they don't really think too much about like what, and maybe they're years away from thinking about what therapeutic indication they're going to be in. But it doesn't hurt to kind of try to understand kind of like how you would develop a drug and what space you develop it in, right? Is there 5 patients in the US, in the EU5, right? Or are there, 5,000, I think it's a combination of internal and external that make companies great. It's the cultural piece, but it's also really understanding kind of like where your drug fits in. It could be the best science, but if it's not practical to develop or market or get reimbursement for, then it's probably not going to make for a great opportunity.
yeah, and does that feed into how when you're designing or building these biotechs, thinking with the end in mind?
I
So
think
actually having that factored into your and built into your thinking when you're designing the early stages.
Yeah, look, I mean, I was a hedge fund manager, right? So I think the focus always for those types of investments are kind of like what's the clinical utility of a particular, by and large, what's the clinical utility of a particular therapeutic, right? And I think you
Yeah,
always have to think about it through that lens. So like I've always been of the mind, you want to do that kind of commercial work, as you say, having the end in mind very early, right? Because it's a good look if you're telling the story externally to either kind of investment strategic partners or incoming personnel, you have an idea of where this is going to go and why this is the right direction to take it in. So yeah, I think having that end goal in mind is very important because it's like, again, you have to think about what's the practicality of developing in a certain indication. And you have to think about kind of like what's the, how would we develop it in a certain indication? Because also it feeds into kind of planning and long-term planning as you start talking to investors, even when you're, because I mean, 3IO is very, very early preclinical, but that doesn't mean that we're not thinking about what a clinical study will look like, right? And where we'll run it and how we'll execute on it. Because I mean, you just have to think, you have to think short, medium, and long term. And for a lot of companies, clinical start is long term, but you have to factor that in because it's part of your value proposition and it's part of your story.
yeah, absolutely. I totally understand what you're saying, and it's a massive part. And with competition and innovation getting more and more fierce, if you like. And are there any key learnings that you've had on that journey, which are new learnings, so things that you didn't necessarily know before moving into the biotech side of things?
No, I mean, I think it's just kind of hammers home how I've always thought about things, right? I mean, you have to really understand what the competitive dynamic looks like, right? And if the competitive dynamic is such that you don't want to be in that particular development space, then maybe you want to make the decision not to. Right? Is it a development space that's like the purview of large pharmaceutical organizations? Then maybe as a small company, you don't want to be there either. Right? So I mean, I think it's really the experience as being an investor that kind of framed this part of how I think
Yeah,
about building and growing is really thinking about those kind of like boring kind of like business dynamic factors about competition and access and things like this that are really, really important.
so from the perspective of your roots as a scientist, if you like, And one of the reasons that we started this podcast, Leading Beyond the Lab, is because we're trying to give information to candidates like scientists or physicians that are looking to move into the sector for the first time. Most people say a version of what you said in terms of fell backwards or they fell into it or something of this nature. So I'd love to know, for the listeners that are from a similar background to yourself, who are considering moving into this side of things, where did it all start for you? And, when you look to embark on the pharma industry?
Well, I mean, I came from a weird place because, like I kind of alluded to, like my formative scientific experience, right? Like before I did my PhD was pharma, right? So I kind of got used to doing things in that way. And it was, it was a very particular kind of niche kind of, not modality because it was small molecules, but it was like a type of antagonist that was, developed in a certain way. But I think if you're coming in the opposite direction, I think there's a couple things that one needs to look out for, right? I mean, certainly doing R&D in large pharmaceutical organizations or even in biotech is very different than in academia, right? It's far more regimented, right? I think you need, because at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is develop a drug, right? So a lot of these, the documentation that goes around experiments is probably a lot more substantial than you would see in academia. Right. So I think it's like either clinicians or scientists coming into big pharma. I just think what people need to be prepared for is a bit of a more of a regimented sort of approach to things. Right. It doesn't mean that you can't be creative. Right. But it's not like being in the lab. Right. In academia, it's very, very different. Right. There's timelines that you have to meet. Right. There's targets that you need to meet and all these sort of things. Right. So I just think people need to be prepared for just a bit more of a regimented environment. And very different than the field that they were in previously. And I think, I think it's for scientists, that's the case, and clinicians, it's certainly the case, right? Because I think, if you're an academic clinician, it's a little bit of a different thing when you're involved in clinical studies that are sponsored by someone else where you're working with the sponsor. It's very different. There's more kind of there's more kind of operational aspects of it. There's more crosstalk with CROs and this type of thing. So I just think there's like I said, I just think there's more regimentation that's present there, and just people need to be prepared.
Yeah, and does that affect the culture or the way in which people work and things like that?
I mean, it can, right? I mean, I think that the issue with the scientist piece, and one of my supervisors once told me, and this was in pharma, right? You have to satisfy the scientist in people, right? People are in the lab because they love science, right? And what is science about is kind of like novel discovery and going down paths that you didn't think you were going to go down to figure out the answer to a question, right? So, I mean, okay, there's targets that need to be met. There's things that need to be done. But I mean, at some level, you have to while maintaining scientific rigor, you have to maintain kind of the freedom that people have to kind of explore and work on their own things. And I think it's helpful in companies to have that kind of, maybe there's some time where you have your own projects that you work on, right? That's on company's time, but maybe something will come out of it, right? I think it's important to kind of like satisfy people's curiosity, because if it's just a machine, right, that's pumping out information, then people get a bit bored. I've seen that.
Yeah, I
right?
can see that.
You need at some level, again, you need to meet your marks, but you need to have some level of flexibility such that people can be intellectually curious, because that's what scientists are.
Yeah, if I think about one of the consistent traits of people that successfully have careers in biotech, they typically are very scientifically curious.
Yeah.
And want to make an impact and see that happen. If you were going to give advice then, to say there's a scientist listening, if there was 3 factors you would say that these are the differences between working in a lab-based environment in academia and working in biotech, what would they be?
Again, it's more regimented. It's probably more fast-paced, right?
Yeah.
And if you're in an academic lab, maybe you come in at 1:00 in the afternoon to start experiments and go for beers and then go home, right? Big pharma organization, that's not possible, right? So more regimented, more fast-paced, and more kind of timelines, right? I mean, I think there's just more kind of, and I don't want to dissuade people, because I think like R&D in biotech and pharma is kind of like the lifeblood of our industry, right? Like that's what brings new kind of therapeutic approaches to the bear. I think at the end of the day, it's just like, it's those 3 things, right? It's just a more regimented environment. There's more timeline. Maybe there's a bit less flexibility, right? But if you're at the right company, they'll recognize that scientists need time to explore.
That wraps up really nicely the journey taken by scientists and physicians into biotech. One thing that is also something that you have a really interesting insight on is the trends that are currently forming in the sector. You're currently working predominantly in oncology, but there's a number of things that are hot topics right now. And I wondered, in particular, looking at something like, for example, AI and how it can potentially impact drug development. Are there any obvious trends that you're seeing forming or things that you see as massive potential upsides?
Look, I mean, the biotech sector on some level is driven by sentiment, and that's investor sentiment. That's like strategic partner sentiment. So there's things that are in favor now that weren't in favor years ago, right? And it's just kind of a waxing and waning effect. Right. I mean, I think there's a couple things that are interesting right now, right? I think a lot of people have become more and more interested in I&I, right? So developing drugs for inflammation, adjudications, right? So that's something that's really, years ago, if you said you were going to be developing a drug for, RA or something like this, people were like, why are you doing that? There's a universe of TNF blockers out there. Now there's a huge amount of interest in the space. And that's not just with small molecules. That's not just with biologics. That's also with T-cell engagers. That's also with cell therapy. We'll see where that goes. So that's an interesting trend. As an immunologist by training, that's something that's very interesting to me.
I started speaking with an I&I company recently in the derm space, and they are focusing on RNAi,
Okay.
RNA interfering in the derm space, which I thought was really interesting, and a CAR-T modality for indications in derm, which was the first time I'd seen that actually.
Yeah, yeah.
So I know what you're saying.
I mean, I was pretty deep in the CAR T space back in the day when I was an investor. And, I remember in those days, it takes one kind of patient report showing like massive kind of tumor responses to get everyone interested in that as a modality, knowing full well that it would be challenging to develop these types of modalities given the nature of, it's bespoke therapy. But it was the same with I&I, right? There was a CAR T that was presented and it was one patient of data, and everyone got really excited about the response. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's one of those things where it's like, it's the sentiment is kind of in that indication. Right. I think ADCs are still fairly hot. Right. That's something that used to be kind of like not really in favor.
Yeah.
I remember investing in Seattle Genetics back in the day and Immunogen, Immunomedics and companies like those that were not particularly interesting for a long time. And then, they started generating data that was like super, super hot. And then, AstraZeneca got involved in other programs and, Gilead acquired Immunomedics and all this sort of stuff. So that's a space that still continues to be interesting. But again, it used to be out of favor. Same with kind of radio-labeled antibodies, right? I remember the days of Actinium, which was a New York-based company. Right. And they had interesting data that really didn't make waves back in the day because everyone was like, well, this is not a modality that makes sense, right? Because of how it, access and distribution, it's very complicated. But now kind of radio antibodies are back in favor. So that's interesting. I mean, gene therapy used to be really hot. Now it's kind of out of favor, right? But again, it could come back with great data. If something's out of favor in this business, wait 5 minutes and then it may come back in.
Yeah, it's like take a long-term investment strategy almost.
Exactly.
I know because when we founded ARTO 5 years ago, a lot of what we were doing was in the CAR-T and TCR space, and particularly within solid tumours. Yeah. And that's kind of gone full circle. And because of the high manufacturing costs and the expected levels of risk increasing, it's less in favour right now. Things like nuclear medicine, like you say, and ADCs and I&I, and also rare diseases seem to be on the up very much. So it is interesting how it trends and changes and what drives those demands.
Well, another thing too is obesity, obviously, right? I mean,
obesity, yeah.
Like 4 or 5 years ago, that was kind of like it was a desert of drug development, and the market leader, liraglutide, was a 500 drug, right?
Really?
Only because it was injected once per day, and then you get the once weekly GLP-1 agonist, and now it's like, it's estimated to be $130 billion market. So any company that has anything to do with obesity around them is obviously the investors are very interested.
And there's so many different options out of that indication as well, the molecule. Yeah. One of our biggest clients is Eli Lilly, and they there's a whole raft of indications and things that we're treating. Outside of that, whether it's diabetes, hormone-based therapies, it's really fascinating what they can do.
Yeah.
And I think there's even new indications coming out which are even more effective with obesity. But I start to wonder where the line is. How much weight do you want to lose?
Yeah, for sure. Sure. And it's not like it's benign, right? I mean, there are kind of safety liabilities for that class, but I mean, I think
absolutely
to be overweight I think, at the end of the day. And it shows you how one's health and one's kind of body composition is important to their overall well-being, because those agents work very well on a lot of different indications.
And do you feel like one of the observations I found recently, I was reading that they had, I think it was Novo and Lilly made up, when you added their market caps up, it was more than the next 8 companies combined, which I
Yeah.
thought was fascinating.
I mean, I
You
think
know,
I may be wrong here, but I remember seeing something recently. You'll fact check me on this, but I remember seeing something recently that Novo's market cap was bigger than the GDP of Denmark.
really?
Yeah, something like this, right? Like, and look, I mean, these are companies that have been focusing,
Yeah.
all the live long day for hundreds of years in cardiometabolic disease, right? And here we are, So
Yeah, it's
sometimes
fascinating.
markets take a while to mature. At Nirsum, actually, we think about this a bit, right? Because we think addiction is a huge market, because there's 7 million people in the US that have opioid use disorder, and a fraction of them are treated because there's no good drugs. It was the same in HIV, right? Which is now a 30-40 billion-dollar market. It's the same in depression. It's the same in schizophrenia. These markets used to be the same with obesity. These markets used to be backwaters, but then it took novel drugs that are easy to use and have good profiles to really kind of unlock latent markets and kind of, hockey stick the thing, to use an
I feel like
egregious.
with addiction as well, there's been media coverage. There's recent films on Netflix, isn't there? Pain Hustlers, I think it's called. I
Yeah.
watched it last weekend, and
Yeah.
it just further enlightens us on how crazy that part of that
Yeah.
time was.
Yeah, people know it's a problem, right? I think it's one of the problems is that there's no good drugs. I mean, there's only a handful of drugs out there that treat the disease in an effective way, right? So there needs to be more. I think if the market kind of, again, if it inflects, I think there'll be far more interest.
Well, is there any other trends that you're seeing from how
I
you're
mean,
thinking the market's moving?
you mentioned AI, and AI is, I mean, look, like many, I use AI every day, right? I mean, I think it's very useful. I think it's useful to take the first step, which is always the hardest step to take on any initiative. I think it helps for productivity, right? And I
Yeah,
think
I
it
agree.
makes things move a bit quicker, right? How much it's going to affect drug development in total, I just don't know, right? I mean, I know there's companies out there that are leveraging it quite aggressively, but I still think you're going to human touch, and I mean, it's gonna help for productivity in the space, and it certainly helps me and a lot of people I work with, just being more efficient with our time and moving forward quickly on different initiatives. But I mean, I wonder how, like, are you just going to have companies that are just AI bots developing drugs? I don't know. I don't think
It's a
so.
strange thought, isn't it, to think it?
Yeah, it's a bit crazy, right? It's a bit crazy, but I do think it's very, very helpful, and not just in biotech, in any space. I mean, it's helpful for productivity. It helps move things quicker.
I work with a CSO who I was talking about this with. She's in the cell therapy space,
Yeah.
and I was asking her about a similar topic, and she said, "Well, actually, funnily enough, last week I was trying to fact check ChatGPT because it doesn't reference check, and she was posing some scientific questions to it, and it was actually making up its responses
Yeah.
because it's designed on an algorithmic kind of foundation to please you. So if it doesn't know the answer, it says something that's quite. And so she was then testing it with questions that she knew the answers to, and it was giving her false answers.
Yeah, I mean,
So
again, that's just a function of that particular functionality in general, right? Like, I mean, I think there's
yeah,
out there that provide you with references, but sometimes
there
when they
is. Yeah,
question and they provide references, you check the reference, and it's just like, well, that's not what you're telling me. There's nothing. So it's not perfect, right? But I think it still can be helpful, but you have to be careful.
your experience is like a meeting point in the middle of a number of different aspects of the biotech world, which is obviously fascinating to most people. So you've got insights into different things at different angles. Now, fundraising over the past 18 to 24 months has been super challenging for a number of different biotechs
Yeah.
across most asset classes or modalities. For the founders that are listening to this, or for people that work in early stage companies who are perhaps looking to get into the clinic for the first time, what tips would you have for them on how to position their businesses as investor worthy, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, I think investors are always thinking about timelines to value inflection, right? It's kind of like an ARB business, investing in biotech, right? Like, people are thinking about, like, if I invest now, where is that money going to take the company, and what does that mean for investment after that runway is expended, right? So I think expressing clear timelines to value inflection, I think, is really important for early early company founders to express to the street. That's something that's of critical importance. Another thing is just to be really, really relentless, right?
Yeah.
Because, the old adage, every pot has a lid, right? And you just have to find the right investors with the right risk tolerance for your stage of company, right? And they're by and large out there, right? But it's really expressing the value proposition to investors that's important, right? And making sure that the data that you're presenting at, in vitro, in vivo, if it's clinical, great, because people are looking for de-risked assets. But for the purposes of this discussion, I think you just need to vocalize what is the timelines and what is the path to value inflection. That's really, really important. And to just, there's thousands of funds out there. Try to talk to all of them.
Is there any specific strategies for almost chance optimization? So being in the right place at the right time. Naturally, there's conferences and things, but is there any creative tips you'd have on how to position yourselves at the right time in the right place, or maybe using certain platforms online or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, there's platforms online that you can use. Like, I mean, PitchBook is a really, really useful resource to, finding different companies. It's a bit pricey for a lot of companies, but I mean, it's useful, right? I mean, if you're out there, as an early stage founder developing a certain kind of technology, you probably know who your competitors are, right? So who invested in your competitors, right? Or maybe it's not like necessarily a competitor, maybe someone that's tangential, right? Like, for instance, if you're developing a certain modality, right, in a certain indication, look who invested in that modality in the past, right? I mean, you can find these people, and, if possible, it's always great to have warm intros to investors, I think, right? Because, sometimes cold emails kind of just go by the wayside.
Agreed.
Yeah, I think, warm introductions, if you can find them, are super helpful. That, I think investors are just trying to triage everything because they're looking at thousands of opportunities. So if there's an opportunity that comes from someone that they know and maybe trust, then that's probably a better reason to pick up the phone.
Yeah, I'd say that's apparent in all lines of work, especially mine as well.
Yeah.
I feel like with LinkedIn and other platforms, things are almost too noisy now.
Yeah.
Which has almost pushed up the valuation, the value created by a personal recommendation, because it's not diluted by all the noise.
Right.
And so if you were going to offer any guidance or advice on having a competitive edge, is there anything else that would come to mind from a biotech perspective?
What do you mean?
So it could be, typically it would relate to people, presentation, services, or something outside of investment, positioning your value proposition to the investors.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think it's really what you have to, there's no secret sauce, I don't think, right? If people are looking for secret sauce here, I mean, there isn't any, right? I mean, either your technology is compelling, or it's not. Your job is to find a way to present an image of this technology that appears compelling and competitive to the street. And it's very simple, right? I think sometimes people lose this in biotech. It's certainly a thing in tech that people focus on all the time. It's just like, what is the problem? How are you solving it? What is the problem? How are you solving it? And why do you think you're solving it with this technology? Right? I mean, I think you need to present it in a certain way, but it's just like, you can't make competitive edge appear out of thin air, right? It has to be, you're starting this company because there is a technology that you have in hand that, ideally serves a purpose in the marketplace and serves a need in the marketplace. Right? So you just have to express that very clearly. What is the problem? What is the solution?
Yeah, and in order to achieve those goals, I think there's no other sector like this one where building high performance teams is so important, and the impact that they can have, particularly when you look at and combine that with the fact that the time to commercialize revenues is so long when compared to most sectors. So, what tips and tricks or what values have you kind of taken on board for your experience when hiring the right people?
Look, I mean, I think you want to have a group of people with a track record of success, right? I mean, I think you want people that have been in this dance before, right? Because it's like, I think with leaders of any organization, you're basically a mile wide and an inch deep in terms of your exposure and experience, right? So you need to hire people smarter than you in their function to get the job done. So that's really important. I think you need to go beyond the CV, right? Because, I think you need to understand through reference checks, references that they provide and references that you find on your own to really understand how these people tick, because it's really important. Like, hiring is so important and you don't want to make missteps. And if you make missteps, it's not a great thing. And I can say that from experience. Um, you really need to scrub it, right? You need people that are trustworthy. You need people that it's apparent that you have a rapport with. I think that's important because it's like, this is a tough business and there's going to be ups and downs. And it's like, do you want to spend hours with these people working on this problem? If the answer is no, then you probably shouldn't hire them. Right. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's about, do you trust them? Have they succeeded in the past? And, do they pass the, go out for a beer test? I think that is
Yeah.
actually important, right?
That's in my category as well, by the way. They have to pass.
I think you can hire people that have all the experience. They've been involved in many development programs. They've been involved in many approvals and difficult indications. They have blockbuster drugs on their CV, but are they not nice people to interact with? If the answer is they're not, then move on.
Yeah, the 3-part test. Can they speak to your clients and manage up? Can
Yeah.
they speak? Can you go out for a beer with them, and can they speak to your mother?
Well, that's the thing. That's why it's important when you're adjudicating candidates. You talk to people that worked for them. You talk to people that were on their same line, and you talk to people that they worked for. Right? I mean, that's really important. I think you need to understand
Yeah.
kind of the whole universe of accountability.
Yeah, we do that actually when we do early stage company build outs, particularly with smaller companies, because naturally the impact that one person can make is significant for
Yeah.
the right and wrong reasons. So,
Yeah.
and we within a specific cluster of, which is usually driven by the indication modality, we
Yeah.
work out, we know the scientists or the MDs and things that have worked with and for those people, but also in other departments, whether it's quality assurance or regulatory affairs,
Yeah.
because they know how they were led by that individual. And the world that we operate is a small one, isn't it?
Yeah. It is.
Particularly within the TA.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, look, I think like understanding how people lead, I think tells you a lot about them as a person, right? If you're not nice to your subordinates, then like there's the door. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, I think
Yeah, yeah.
it shows a lot about people when they don't treat their reports well. I think
And your values.
exactly.
Yeah.
I think what's important in this business is, and it sounds kind of hokey, but I'm a firm believer in it. You want people to be happy and challenged in their work. If you get that, right, you'll get a lot out of people. And if you don't, their tenure at your organization is probably not long.
Yeah, and there's definitely something to be said for when you're fulfilled, you almost gain some energy, don't you? Rather
Yeah.
than just drag. When you're
Yeah,
working towards a goal, you gain energy. You get like a super supply.
for
Whereas if
sure.
it is just a job, if you're there to make ends meet, it doesn't have the same impact on you.
Doesn't have the same impact. Yeah.
So when building these teams, naturally timescales can be difficult. What's your process for ensuring that you're ahead of the curve? So you're finding the right people at the right time to hit the certain critical business milestone.
Yeah, look, I mean, it's about it's about internal kind of communication, right? Like you need to be, I mean, this is kind of an overarching theme, right? I mean, I think there needs to be, and stems from trust. There needs to be
Yeah.
good communication within the organization in terms of like, from the top, what are the priorities, what needs to be done? And then, down the chain, what sort of resources are required to do it. Right. So I think, in the organizations that I've been at, it's really about kind of communication internally, right? If we want to launch another trial, how many more people do we need in operations? How many more people do we need? Do we need more people in regulatory? Do we need to support, pharmacovigilance or whatever? Right. I mean, I think it's really about kind of communication with the team. And it's like, what are the long-term plans here? And be very open and transparent about it. Because again, when people feel that you're telling them what's happening, then they're going to be more kind of willing to like do the job and do the job well and have a long tenure at the organization. So I think, it's really about keeping people kind of abreast of what happens. And what's going to happen. And I think a great way of doing that is just like continuously having kind of like all hands meetings that are casual, just kind of discussing kind of what the thoughts are from the top and what the plans are going forward. And then you're not going to be left holding the bag and wish you had more kind of support, because hiring is, you can't snap your fingers and hire people, right? It takes time. So I think you need
Absolutely.
there's a study that's ongoing. I think it's you need to plan for building out. And I think it's really about kind of communication and just talking to people about what it is that they need. I probably spent a bit too much time doing this, but I really tried to kind of have one-on-one interactions with a lot of my senior people at the organizations that I've been at, because I think, they feel heard, and they understand what's going on. Right. And then in those kind of conversations, you can get you can get a feel of kind of where are the shortcomings of the organization, what needs to be backfilled in terms of personnel or resource, right? So I think that's helpful. And again, I think really the answer to your question is just communication, really just being very transparent with your team and your team being transparent with you about what the needs are.
Yeah, I think that feeds hand in hand, doesn't it, as well, with retention of the best people, because it's a competitive landscape out there. And if you aren't doing that, particularly at the higher ends, that they will be gone. They won't stay because they won't be fulfilled. They won't be happy. And it has a knock-on effect to the business, and the cost of rehiring mounts up.
Exactly.
That wraps up the main part of our podcast. The last few questions, somewhat of a closing tradition, is on leadership. So it's a quick fire question on leadership. So from your experience, I'd love to know what are the 3 personality traits, in your opinion, that make up a great leader?
Let's see. So what are the 3 traits that make a good leader? One is, I think, kind of like mental toughness, right? You have to have the memory, like I hate to quote Ted Lasso, but I will. You have to be a goldie, right? You have to, like if something bad happens or you're disappointed, you just have to forget about it and move on, right? I think that's really important, right? I think you need to be someone that communicates well and is communicative, right? You need to talk to your people, and your people need to understand what you want to do, and you need to understand what they want and how they want to develop as people. And I think that there's more than 3, by the way, but I'll give you a third: humility, right? I think you can't be successful in this business and be arrogant, because biology, as a wise person once told me, biology will always win, right? So you need to be humble in this business, because you're going to get knocked down, and you just need to expect it. And I'll throw in an extra one: curiosity. You need to be a curious person. You need to have an insatiable drive to find answers, right? Because that's what this business is. If you don't have a high degree of curiosity, then I don't think you're going to be very successful.
Amazing. Thank you, Michael. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you.
Yeah.
I'm conscious of your of timings and that you've got to go now because you've got a hard stop, but thank you so much. We covered a whole load of things there. Massive topics with massive impacts on the business that we operate. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Lawrence. It was really fun. Appreciate your time.